Myth Vision.
Welcome to Myth Vision, your host Derek Lambert. Here we are with the famous, the infamous, the heretical Dr. Robert M. Price. How are you, sir?
I'm doing great. Sweating a little bit in the North Carolina weather, but doing well despite it.
57 degrees where I'm at.
Lucky stiff.
Yes, sir. Today we're going to be talking about The Christ Myth and Its Problems, the book by Dr. Robert M. Price. And some of the things we're going to discuss is kind of showing you why mythicism's even plausible and why, where is this historical Jesus in light of this copying that we see from Old Testament text. People like, some people call it typology, midrash. There's this connection from Old to New Testament. And if it is history, or if there is history, how can one really know after one has seen and digested all the Old Testament stories and then looks at the New and goes, that's Joseph, hold on, that's Elijah, oh, that's Moses, where's the Jesus at? And so where do you draw the line? And so maybe we could talk about some of those things, and your book, if you don't mind taking me on a journey, I'm here.
I wanted to explore one of my favorite examples of where it seems clear to me, at least, that a gospel passage is overtly, practically, based on an Old Testament passage. And it has to do with Mark chapter 3 reflecting Exodus 18, which, of course, I have to read if you'll indulge me. In Exodus 18:1. This is after the plagues and the crossing of the sea and all that. Jethro, the priest of Midian, Moses' father-in-law, heard all that God had done for Moses and for Israel, his people, how Yahweh had brought Israel out of Egypt. Now Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, had taken Zipporah, Moses' wife, after he had sent her away, and her two sons, of whom the name of the one was Gershom, for he said, I have been a sojourner, Hebrew ger, in a foreign land, and the name of the other, Eleazar, for he said, the God of my father was my help, and God is El, and help is Eitzer, Eleazar, and delivered me from the sword of Pharaoh. And Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, came with his sons and his wife to Moses in the wilderness, where he was encamped at the mountain of God. And when one told Moses, lo, your father-in-law Jethro is coming to you with your wife and her two sons with her, Moses went out to meet his father-in-law and did obeisance, or bowed down, and kissed him. And they asked each other of their welfare and went into the tent. Then Moses told his father-in-law all that Yahweh had done to Pharaoh and to the Egyptians for Israel's sake, all the hardship that had come upon them in the way, and how Yahweh had delivered them. And Jethro rejoiced for all the good which Yahweh had done to Israel, in that he had delivered them out of the hand of the Egyptians. And Jethro said, blessed be Yahweh, who has delivered you out of the hand of the Egyptians and out of the hand of Pharaoh. Now I know that Yahweh is greater than all gods, because he delivered the people from under the hand of the Egyptians when they dealt arrogantly with them. And Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, offered a burnt offering and sacrifices to God. And Aaron came with all the elders of Israel to eat bread with Moses' father-in-law before God. On the morrow, Moses sat to judge the people, and the people stood about Moses from morning till evening. What was he doing, by the way? Break in there. As a judge, he would hear cases brought to him. Like when the kings did this. Like Solomon has a real tough case where these two prostitutes bring in a baby, and each claims to be the mother of the baby and says that the other had a baby but accidentally smothered it to death in her sleep. So they're too bad, but let me have my baby. How's he going to tell? There was no DNA tests. And so he comes up with this great thing. Well, I'll tell you what we'll do. We'll chop the baby in half and each of you can have a piece. And he knows that the real mother is going to say, no, 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 give him to her. Better that somebody have the whole baby and he lives, right? Well, that's the kind of thing they used to do, like on these judges shows, Judge Wapner and Judge this, Judge Judy, and all that. People are brought before her and she rules on the case. Well, that's what ancient kings used to do. And so he's surrounded by people in the whole Israelite community with gripes against each other and so forth. And all day Moses is doing this. Okay, when Moses' father-in-law saw all that he was doing for the people, he said, "What is this that you are doing, and all the people for the people? Why do you sit alone, and all the people stand about you from morning till evening?" And Moses said to his father-in-law, "Because the people come to me to inquire of God. When they have a dispute, they come to me, and I decide between a man and his neighbor, and I make them know the statutes of God and his decisions." Moses' father-in-law said to him, "What you're doing is not good. You and the people with you will wear yourselves out, for the thing is too heavy for you. You are not able to perform it alone. Listen now to my voice. I will give you counsel, and God be with you. You shall represent the people before God and bring their cases to God, and you shall teach them statutes and the statutes and the decisions, and make them know the way in which they must walk and what they must do." Now, let me pause again. What does he mean, bring them before God? Well, Moses was acting as an oracle. He would go into a trance. Shamans do this even today all over the world, and the Oracle of Delphi did this. You didn't rely on mere human wisdom, so you thought. You were going into a trance, and God would tell you. He'd give the verdict, and this would be written down and be, or at least remembered. And this is the way this story says the Torah originated, with oracular decisions from Moses. Okay, now we know what to do next time this kind of dispute comes up, and so forth. Okay. Moreover, choose able men from all the people, such as fear God, men who are trustworthy and who hate a bribe, and place such men over the people as rulers of thousands, of hundreds, of fifties, and of tens, and let them judge the people at all times. Every great matter they shall bring to you, but any small matter they shall decide themselves. So it will be easier for you, and they will bear the burden with you. If you do this, and God so commands you, then you will be able to endure, and all this people also will go to their place, the promised land, in peace. And okay, so Moses gave heed to the voice of his father-in-law and did all that he had said. Moses chose able men out of all Israel and made them heads over the people, rulers of thousands, of hundreds, of fifties, and of tens, and they judged the people at all times. Hard cases they brought to Moses, but any small matter they decided themselves. Then Moses let his father-in-law depart, and he went his way to his own country. So you see what's going on there. There's a tiered court system. These lower court judges, I mean, that's literally what they were, have the benefit of the statutes that Moses made directly from the word of God in a prophetic trance, and so they will apply these laws. But if something new comes up, Moses is the supreme court, but let's not bother him with the small matters. So this no doubt was written to um, give a legal precedent for a court system in ancient Israel at some point. That's why it's recorded here. It's like it's claiming the authority of Moses because they're going to apply the Torah, which they figured originated with him. But that's the story. Now, here in Mark chapter 3, we have what I think is an interestingly edited retelling of that story. Okay, in Luke 3:7 and following. Jesus withdrew with his disciples to the sea, and a great multitude from Galilee followed, also from Judea and Jerusalem and Idumea, and from beyond the Jordan, and from about Tyre and Sidon. Um, uh, a great multitude, hearing all that he did, came to him, and he told his disciples to have a boat ready for him because of the crowd, lest they should crush him. For he had healed many, so that all who had diseases pressed upon him to touch him. And whenever the unclean spirits beheld him, they fell down before him and cried out, "You are the Son of God." And he strictly ordered them not to make him known. And why is that? Well, because he's already being, you know, crushed by the crowd. Like, if you ever seen A Hard Day's Night, the poor Beatles can't go anywhere without being mobbed, right? Same thing. So there are great works of healing that are done here that kind of correspond to God doing miracles to save Israel from the Pharaoh. Okay. Verse 13, and he went up into the hills and called to him those whom he desired, and they came to him. And he appointed 12 to be with him, and to be sent out to preach, and have authority to cast out demons. Simon, whom he surnamed Peter, James the son of Zebedee, and John the brother of James, whom he surnamed Boanerges, that is, sons of thunder, Andrew and Philip and Bartholomew and Matthew and Thomas, and James the son of Alphaeus and Thaddeus, and Simon the Canaanian, or the Zealot, and Judas Iscariot, who betrayed him. Now you notice the similarity with the list of the sons of Moses. Tells you their name, which you really don't need to understand the story, and it explains why they have those names. They're commemorating God's help and so forth. Okay. Then he went home, and the crowd came together again so that they could not even eat. And when his friends heard it, or when his own heard it, as some translations have, when his family heard it, they went out to seize him. And they said, he's beside himself. And the scribe, now why'd they say that? Well, here's the parallel to Moses being surrounded by seekers all the time, and his father-in-law, wife, and kids come to help him somehow, right? We're building up the parallel here. Okay, and the scribes who came down from Jerusalem said, he's possessed by Beelzebul, and by the prince of demons he casts out the demons. And he called them to him, and he said to them in parables, how can Satan cast out Satan? If a kingdom is divided against itself, that kingdom cannot stand. And if a house is divided against itself, that house will not be able to stand. And if Satan has risen up against himself and is divided, he cannot stand, but is coming to an end. But no one can enter a strong man's house and plunder his goods unless he first binds the strong man. Then indeed he may plunder his house. Let's see here. I got to turn this ancient manuscript page here. Truly I say to you, all sins will be forgiven the sons of men, and whatever blasphemies they utter. So slanders, blasphemies means. But whoever blasphemes against the Holy Spirit never has forgiveness, but is guilty of an eternal sin. For they had said, he has an unclean spirit. And his mother and his brothers came, and standing outside, they sent to him and called him. And a crowd was sitting about him, and they said to him, your mother and your brothers are outside asking for you. And he replied, who are my mother and my brothers? And looking around on those who sat about him, he said, here are my mother and my brothers. Whoever does the will of God is my brother and sister and mother. So what's happened here? We have, basically, let the cat out of the bag. I think somebody in the early church just flat out pretty much copied the Moses version Great things have happened. As a result, Moses is now mobbed every day, all day, people seeking his help and his wisdom. And his relatives come and say, you can't go on like this. It's going to drive you nuts. Here, why don't you pick some assistants to share the work with you? And then he does. He sees that that was wise, and thanks, dad-in-law. That's just what I'm going to do. And in the first Christian rewrite, it seems to me this was a way of saying that Jesus' relatives, who had great clout in the early church, they were the leaders of some faction, the supposed um, family of Jesus. That's another problem I'll get into later, but that they had the same role that Jethro did. They saw Jesus unable to take a lunch break, as it says, and they say this is why they thought he was crazy. So he says, they say to him, why don't you appoint, say, 12 guys to share the burden of your work? And in the original telling, Jesus would have gone up to the mountain to pray and to choose the 12, some of whose names are defined for the reader, Boanerges and so on, just like Moses' sons' names were defined for the reader. And everybody lived happily ever after. And so credit is given to the heirs, as they were called, the heirs of Jesus, pretty much the same as the pillar saints of Jerusalem, Cephas, James, and John, and so on. Credit is given them for the establishment of the 12 as the leadership group of another faction that would tend to subordinate the 12 to the heirs, but it does give credit to both. It's an attempt to establish a kind of pecking order. Well, there were even more serious disputes between the Jewish Christian factions, of which we know of several, and factions, that is. And so now somebody decided they would take the credit for the naming of the 12 from the relatives of Jesus, who are now made to be parallel with the scribes from Jerusalem who think he's insane. And Jesus even repudiates them at the end of the story. No relatives of mine. You got to be a believer in me to count as that, and you folks do, not those creeps. And so now the new version condemns the faction of the family of Jesus and makes the choosing of the 12 simply Jesus' own idea. And then he names the 12, just as I think the 70 elders are named by Moses to help him. You have even details of the thing. Somebody from the outside saying, hey, your relatives are here and they want to see you. But then the big difference is Jesus repudiates them. It doesn't say, bring them on in. He tell them to get the hell out. Whereas in Exodus, Moses is quite happy both to greet Jethro and to take his advice. So it's retold and then reversed, including the order of it, since in Mark, the choice of the 12 takes place before his family comes on the scene, so it can't have been their idea. Now, you might think, Price, what kind of Rube Goldberg setup is this? I don't think it's that far-fetched, since we know what motives made people, or we surmise very reasonably, I think, the motives of these factional disputes in the early church that would have led to redoing the story. And both parts of the stories, both parts of both stories parallel one another pretty closely, even though their order has been reversed with these implications by the Christian writer. I find this, though I don't think I've ever seen it in a commentary, this just seems obvious to me, that there was at first a friendly Christian rewrite of the Exodus 18 story, and then an unfriendly revision of it by Christian scribe afterward. There are multitudinous other examples of this, and in the book, the main chapter of the book, The Christ Myth Theory and Its Problems, some would say, well, this really isn't what Jews meant by midrash. And I know I'm extending the term a bit, since originally midrash denoted a kind of expansion of biblical tales in order to bring out what these rabbis thought they really meant. There's a joke Jews circulate about this. Two rabbis are debating whether you have to wear a yarmulke, the Jewish skull cap that men wear. And they both agree that you should, but one says, is there any biblical warrant for this? And the other one says, well, sure, look right here in Genesis 12, I think it is. It says right here, and just read it. And he says, okay, and Abraham went out from there. I don't see any reference to the yarmulke. And he says, would Abraham go out without a yarmulke? Well, and that sort of settles it. Well, that's midrashic thinking. You're retelling the story, at least implicitly, in order to bring out what you think it really means. And all right, that's not exactly what's going on here, but I think I'm pretty safe in it. This part of my book originally appeared in the Encyclopedia of Midrash, edited by Jacob Neusner, who was the great authority on ancient Judaism. So yeah, there's an example, and again, there are many, but there are other problems I mentioned with the Christ myth theory. And of course, in a book like this, when I say that, I mean, here are some answers to those. And let me just quickly tell you about a couple of them.
Please do.
One is the importance of James the Just, who at least Protestant scholars think is a character who was not one of the 12. He wouldn't have been a disciple or an apostle. Now, this is bracketing other issues, like Walter Schmidholz argues very convincingly to me that the idea of a group of 12, even if you believe in a historical Jesus, didn't actually happen, that it was a later leadership group that kind of got read back into the story to authenticate their position. But let's leave that alone. Let's suppose there were. Protestant scholars think this James the Just, James the Righteous, as he was called in the early church, he wasn't one of these, but he was the successor to Jesus in Jerusalem. He was the first bishop of Jerusalem. And that it's interesting that in Acts 15, the so-called Jerusalem Council, Peter speaks on behalf of the Gentiles becoming Christians and not having to keep all the kosher laws, etc. And then James gets up and gives a ruling, like he's superior in authority to Peter, who we think of as the Prince of Apostles. So James is a pretty important guy. Well, is he? He said in the Epistle of the Galatians to be the Lord's brother. Paul says, I went to Jerusalem and met none of the apostles at the time except Cephas and James, the brother of the Lord. Well, apologists always say, well, look, that kind of shows Paul was a contemporary of Jesus. That Jesus wasn't some ancient figure, nor was Jesus a phantom or a heavenly being who appeared on earth in visions but had never actually walked the earth. Well, that can't be if Paul says he met the brother of the Lord. And so much for that. I'm sure you've read how Bart Ehrman makes much of that.
Oh, yeah.
What is and there have been several rejoinders to that, not created, by the way, by mythicists. The most important one is that there's reason to believe that that passage in Galatians 3, I think it is not original to the text. One reason for this is that in Tertullian's works against Marcion, he is trying to show that Paul and the 12 were bosom buddies. They weren't in competition. And he says, take a look in the Paul's visit to Jerusalem. He sought their imprimatur on what he was doing, and they said, "Fine, great. Here's the right hand of fellowship." Um, and he it was Peter and James the Just, James the brother of the Lord, that okayed it. No, wait a second. I'm scratch that. In his visit to Jerusalem, he met with the apostles, and they okayed what he was saying. But the thing about meeting James, the brother of the Lord, is in an earlier chapter where he says that was his first visit, and then later it was the second visit. Why would Tertullian simply skip this first vision where he met James, the brother of the Lord? I mean, if that means what it says, it certainly implies that Tertullian would have this would have proved his case, and but he doesn't mention it. That's very odd. Well, not so much if somebody interpolated that to make Galatians more of a refutation of Marcion. And so this may not even have been in the original text. So it was a non-mythicist who pointed this out long ago. And so we may be dealing with a kind of a phantom here anyway, but let's suppose that it was in the text. The idea of being a brother of Jesus, which it doesn't say, by the way, it says the brother of the Kurios, the brother of the Lord. It doesn't say brother of Jesus, for whatever that's worth. um, that kind of language is you find elsewhere in early Christianity, where Thomas, in the Gospel of Thomas and a couple of other works, is said to be the twin of Jesus, and they explain it as meaning he has become the mirror image of Jesus because he is advanced to his point. He's the most astute of all the disciples. And famous, I think it's saying 13, Jesus asks the big question, make a comparison, tell me who I'm like. And I think Peter says, you're like a wise philosopher. And Matthew says, you're like a great angel. And Thomas says, Master, my mouth cannot say what you are like. And, it's too much. You can't put it into words, a good Gnostic saying. And Jesus says, blessed are you. I am not your master because you have drunk from the spring I dole out. So he has become just like Jesus, and he won't even tell the other disciples what else Jesus said to him. They're not ready for it. Well, they're not saying that he was born and he was in the same maternity ward in the crib next to Jesus. It's like he has become like him, hence a brother, the twin. There's a reference in 1 Corinthians 7 to the brethren of the Lord. Does that mean the guys who were listed in Mark chapter 6, or is that simply a name for early Christian missionaries, as in Matthew 25? If you haven't done it to the least of these my brethren, who are pretty clearly supposed to be missionaries, you didn't do it to me. If you did help them, you helped me. Or in 3 John, it says the brethren have gone out in Jesus' name, and we ought to help them in their travels. I don't care how much ridicule gets heaped on mythicists for saying that, but that is entirely plausible. Ultimately, we don't know what it means, but it could mean various things. And to lay the weight of a historical individual, Jesus, on that seems very, very iffy. Then one last element of that, to show how the brother of the Lord, or even brother of Jesus, could be understood even by later people as not a statement of blood brotherhood. In the 19th century, you had this guy, I can't think of his name now, who proclaimed himself the Messiah of the Taiping movement. He claimed to be Hong Zi Huan or something like that. I'm fading here. Um, he claimed to be the Messiah and the little brother or younger brother of Jesus. Was this guy claiming to be 1900 years old, like Mel Brooks in that routine? No. No, what he means is he sees himself as in what we might call a fourth person of the Godhead, that he has now visited earth from heaven just as Jesus did so many centuries ago. Who knows what the heck that it doesn't mean something like that with this character, James, the brother of the Lord. So who knows, right? It's impossible to say, but I think you can show that it's just like picking a number out of a hat to insist that James, the brother of the Lord, means, oh yeah, Jesus had a blood brother and circumcised on the same day and so forth. So that's one supposed problem that I don't think is a problem. One other one, Earl Doherty, whose work I have great respect for, he and many others say the epistles of Paul are earlier than the Gospels, and they don't seem to know any of the material that is in the Gospels. They never quote sayings of Jesus from there. They don't know anything about Jesus being a miracle worker or an exorcist. It's not even clear that Jesus was put to death by political authorities. It could just as easily mean that evil angels somehow crucified him, and so on and so on. Why doesn't he know what happened in the Gospels? Well, because these things were not, these stories and sayings were not yet being told. Where there are parallels between the epistles, like in Romans chapter 12, sort of sounds like the Sermon on the Mount, but doesn't quote it. People began perhaps to take stuff out of Paul's epistles and then attribute it to Jesus, just the opposite, right? So they say you need the Gospels to be later than the epistles in order to make this argument. The earlier texts, the epistles of Paul, know nothing really of the gospel Jesus, who appears full blown decades later in the gospel. So, in the meantime, in the gap, you have the creation of a historical Jesus to anchor in history the kind of celestial, mythical Jesus Paul believed in. Well, as we've discussed on Myth Vision before, I tend to go along with the Dutch radical scholars who say, nah, Paul was a famous name, just like Peter was, and a number of spurious writings were later attributed to each of them. And so, though there may have been a Paul who was important in his day, these letters don't go back to him. There are numerous indications that they're written decades later, at the end of the first or even into the second century. Okay, now that seems to foul up this important mythicist argument, but so that would be a problem with it, except that, as I point out, you can't make a concrete timeline like that, not in terms of what was written before what, though that's obviously very debatable from what I just said, but how Christian thought developed. You also cannot assume that it developed all in one straight line, that everybody believed in this and then everybody switched over to believe in that and everybody changed and believed this. There's no, that's based on this mythic notion that all early Christians believed the same thing, which they certainly did not. And so all you can tell here is that the group of Christians, Marcionites, Gnostics, Paulinists, whatever you want to call them, they had the notion of a celestial Jesus without any historical historical entanglements. But whoever wrote the Gospels, they were incorporating legends of Jesus as a figure on earth. Who knows if they even knew each other? It's just one seems to be all myth, the other all legend or Old Testament rewrite. You don't know which one is earlier. You just have documents from each faction. And so that then it's up to us as historians to try to surmise how the whole progress of an evolution of Christology developed. And so I don't, and I have a chapter in this book called something like, Does the Myth Theory Require an Early Date for the Epistles? And I try to explain this at more length. Um, so that, and so I mentioned these problems that I think are easily soluble, and that it's important not to come up with contrived ad hoc hypotheses, which we ridicule apologists for doing. And if someone judges my explanations to be that, I welcome them to reject the Christ myth theory. I don't see them as problems, but here it is.
There's a lot of layers to what you're saying here, because I've been interviewing a lot of people here on Myth Vision that are on the historical side, or that are kind of agnostic about it, or whatever, and they don't really have as much, if you will, of a firm skepticism about the approach. So they think, well, there probably was, and some guys are saying there was a Jesus. And a lot of what I hear goes something like this, and maybe you can tag on when I'm done with what I'll phrase here. Paul comes first. This is a real guy, okay? As they would suggest, there's a real guy named Paul running around who was probably a persecutor of the church. Turns out he decides, you know what, I feel bad for these guys. I just saw their Lord. He appeared to me like the sun in the sky, and I went blind. And anyway, he decides he's going to follow these guys, right? And that may be a later addition to Paul. Paul may not have had that road to Damascus experience. It may have been added. But nonetheless, Paul's on the scene first. Then you have Gospels that come later. They want to go with scholarship, and they say it's in the 50s. Now, I asked them this because I just had a show with Eisenman, Professor Eisenman, and C.H. Lawson. Okay, both of them believe in a historical Jesus, but Eisenman was talking about the historical James. He was talking about how these Dead Sea Scroll texts actually correlate to the events that are taking place with the first century, and how you have pretty much a radical sect that's nationalistic, xenophobic, and then you have this movement that is a Herodian style movement by Paul that is trying to combat them. Now, I asked him, I said, Paul talks about this death, burial, resurrection of a guy named Jesus. Jesus is supposedly the brother of James. As you know, Eisenman, he literally titles his book that, and not James, brother of the Lord. He says the brother of Jesus. Well, when I asked him, I said, well, who's this Jesus guy that Paul is talking about that died and rose again? Did they really believe that there was a guy there that died and rose again? Is that all pagan? Because what I was getting the hint from, Dr. Bob, was that Jesus could easily have been a whole fabricated version of something out of this sect from the Roman side, or at least a Herodian, a pro-Hellenized side, and took a possible character, if James was a brother of this guy, and created a narrative taking away the power of this movement from a guy named James and giving it to his brother, and then deifying. I mean, I'm just saying, it was like it started making me think. And then when C.H. Lawson was, Christopher Lawson was discussing back, which, it's hard to get a word in with Eisenman sometimes, but he kept cutting him off, and he's like, Lawson, we don't know anything about him. We can't say Jesus was the king of this movement, or he was royal, or he was this and that. We don't know anything about him. Where are you finding this? And it almost sounded like where Bart Ehrman will say in one cheek, mythicism, and then in the other cheek he's like, no, he absolutely existed. And you go, what's going on here?
Yeah, Eisenman says, I think, at the very last line of James, the brother of Jesus, he says, whatever Jesus was, he was the same as James, implying that he must have been a priestly revolutionary like zealots and Essenes and all of that. He hardly gets into it, but he does say he thinks that Jesus was pretty much the same. That's been a long time. Maybe he's changed his mind a bit, but yeah, I think that Lawson is taking more of a Brandon-like um, stance, though that he and Eisenman wind up having a lot in common because Brandon, of course, thinks that Jesus was a sword bearing anti Roman revolutionary and that the gospel Jesus is a much toned down and Romanized version, which is very much what Eisenman says also. So I should think that Lawson and Eisenman have more agreement than disagreement.
You would think that for sure, but I appreciate, you jumping on here. Everybody, you've got to get Dr. Bob's book, The Christ Myth and Its Problems. And he delves deep into these issues. And I might as well plug his other book, too, that I think was touched here, The Colossal Apostle, and how the epistles that are supposedly authentic are patchwork quilts. They are, and I always love this quote that he makes. He makes an amazing quote. He says, you might think I'm swatting at gnats at first, but eventually I'm consuming whole camels. So be sure to check out the book and get down in the description. Get you a copy, get a PDF, get you the ebook, get the hard copy, show him some love, and go to his website. Be sure to join his Patreon, give him some donations, whatever, to help him for his work he does, so we can get Dr. Bob back on here again and talk to you guys more about some of the Christ myth theory. Thank you, Dr. Bob. Any closing statements?
Yeah, I have just revived something I did several years ago now. I am willing to take on students to be tutored in all these higher critical Old and New Testament topics, or to go through a particular book of the Bible with them, like weekly for an hour. For as many weeks as people want to, and of course there'd be a fee to it. I couldn't afford to do it otherwise, but I'm beginning to do that again. And if you are interested in that, you could email me at Criticus, Criticus, at AOL.com. And I don't have a whole lot of slots for that, but I'd certainly be willing to do that with a handful of people. I've one so far this time around, and I've not advertised it at all until this moment. But think about that if anyone's interested in it.
Thank you, Dr. Bob. I might take you up on that offer sometime myself to delve deeper into some of these texts with you, and you can teach me what you've picked up and things you've caught with your eye. You heard it from the man. Guys, go show him some love and email him, criticus at AOL.com.
Right. Uh-huh.
Check him out and be sure to ask him if you're, what the cost is, because I'm sure he's got a reasonable price, but he's got to make something, and I don't blame you one bit. But hey, Myth Vision Podcast, Derek Lambert, peace.